Hello, and welcome back to the Land and Climate podcast. My name is Alasdair, and this time I spoke to Margareth Aritonang, an Indonesian journalist currently working for investigative outfit the Gecko Project, about her investigation into the business interests of the newly inaugurated President of Indonesia, Prabowo Subianto. Indonesia is a resource-rich country, and its vast forests are a major source of plant diversity and wildlife. Yet, it also has, amongst other things, a large-scale timber industry, and is now threatened by mass deforestation and the degradation of its remaining natural habitats. It is also the third largest coal producer in the world, and with the growth of the Indonesian economy still highly tied to fossil fuel use, some experts have predicted that its carbon emissions could actually continue to grow in future years. However, in recent weeks, as part of his diplomatic tour of the world, the new Indonesian president has made a climate commitment to retiring all of the country's coal power plants within 15 years. This could be challenging, given coal power accounts for currently around 60% of electricity use in the country. In a previous podcast, we spoke to Timur Manarung of Arigo Nusantara about the threats of the emerging biomass industry in Indonesia. He pointed us to the investigations of the Gecko Project, which explore the crossover between business and politics in the country and how conflicts of interest could potentially harm the Indonesian environment and efforts to tackle climate change.
When I shared the report to some politicians that I have known from my career reporting on politics, surprisingly, they told me that this is not new. And he's not the only one who has companies and who has been playing in extractive industries. I got that from many politicians, yeah. At least from politicians that I talked to, none of them told me something like, this is really important and we need to do something. As if it's common practice, and nothing is wrong with that.
I started by asking Margaret to give some background into her investigation of the Indonesian president.
We started doing that investigations before the elections in February this year. At that time, we saw a pattern of increasing number of businessmen joining politics in Indonesia. So based on that brief information and looking at the trend, we were curious, how would this trend be reflected in the presidential election? Prabowo is our current president. Prabowo Subianto is a very influential politician because he himself comes from a big family and a long history with power. We've heard that he has lots of businesses, but we never knew how massive his business interests were. So we jumped in looking into corporate profiles and NGOs reports, and we were able to map and identify around 20 companies that are connected to him. We found that most, if not all of those companies are in the extractive sector. We found that of all of those companies connected to him, at least 12 of them are directly connected to him in a sense that he owns shares of those companies either as minority or majority shareholders. Most of those companies are operating coal mining businesses. Some are in industrial timber plantation. Few companies that are not directly connected to him operate fishing, palm oil. We cannot see him on company papers as shareholders, but if we track all of the managers, it would go back to all of his closest political allies.
So there's not always evidence of direct ownership of these businesses, but then that also some of these businesses aren't actually active. Can you explain what you think is going on there when you're finding that there's actually, there's a whole set of businesses that don't seem to be operating?
First, we were also confused. What is the motive of obtaining or securing a number of licenses or ownership of land? But sources we talked to help us understand and interpret what that means. Most of the inactive concessions are meant for land banking. They also suggested that if all laws and regulations were implemented properly, the ownership or licenses of all of inactive concessions should have been revoked, yeah?
Now that Prabowo has come to power, it was only a month ago that he was actually inaugurated as the president. These concessions that he have will ultimately be exploited.
The thing is, we cannot say certainly until it happens. But at least from the sources we talk to, and many of these these sources that we talk to are long-time environmental activists, who have worked closely on this matter. At least from their understanding, now that he is the top leader, the concessions that were being enacted would be exploited or things would happen.
What listeners might be interested in is the implications of the head of government having ownership of huge concessions, either directly in their name or indirectly.
President Prabowo is not the only one who has these twin roles, as business person and officials. We have increasing number of those people. Those are business persons in government, in the parliament, and many have expressed concerns of potential misuse of power, or corruption even. Just to give you an example, in 2021 or around 2022, we looked into a food estate project in Gunung Mas in East Kalimantan, At that time, the project was supervised by the Defense Ministry, who was led by Prabowo in his capacity as Defense Minister then. And that project was managed by a private company that was set up close to the inauguration of that project. So it's a new company. And if you look at the management of that company, managed by Prabowo's political allies, and some of them were legislators, who are now ministers, and many have assessed that the project, the Cassava project, failed. But there is no accountability, as if nothing happens, And it's only one project. And looking at that one example, I don't know what will happen if someone has the access to resources of a country as big as Indonesia.
Is this particularly new? I mean, you said that one of the reasons that you started your investigation was because you noticed the pattern of business people moving into politics. But isn't that something that's been going on in Indonesian politics for a very long time?
Yeah, it's true. But we are seeing more and more of that, especially now Indonesia is one of the attention for extractive industry like nickel.
I just thought it was really interesting reading some of the actual interests that Prabowo was involved in and how it looks like he wasn't a particularly successful businessman either. Externally, he's presenting himself as a kind of big businessman and relatively successful businessman.
Some have interpreted it that way, because he has expressed difficulties in getting loans, for example, to finance some of his businesses. Some have interpreted the inactivity within some of his concessions as a sign of business failure as well, for not being able to finance that.
Was there any response from anyone around the investigation that you made?
We only got a confirmation from his press division head, that they got the request, but nothing happened. At that time, we were transitioning former President Jokowi to President Prabowo, a lot of cabinet talks, etc. But I don't know what's the real reason, I think President Prabowo got lots of requests for interviews as soon as he won the election,
Indonesian politics is fairly complex, and your investigation is very specific on looking at those business interests of the president. What reaction should there be, if any, to the kinds of things that you're uncovering? Is there something government should be doing differently? I mean, it sounds like there's a lack of transparency about business interests and the mix between business and politics in Indonesia.
When I shared the report to some politicians that I have known from my career reporting on politics, surprisingly, they told me that this is not new. And he's not the only one who has companies and who has been playing in extractive industries. I got that from many politicians, At least from politicians that I talked to, none of them told me something like, this is really important and we need to do something, as if it's common practice, and nothing is wrong with that. Critical responses came from civil society groups and then fellow journalists, researchers. It seems to me that potential misuse of power from twin positions, twin roles, only matter for people who are outside of power, because we are potentially the victims of this practice,
Okay, so the implication from that is that the mix of business and political interests feels systemic. There's not a huge political reaction or surprise given that the response from politicians is everyone is implicated in a sense.
It posed serious problem, for us as a country, because if you relate that to law enforcement, I could say that many, if not all, policies regarding law enforcement must go through the parliament, Laws, regulations must go through the parliament, and the parliament would discuss those with the government. And the current government is securing the majority parliamentarian seats. I don't think we have opposition power anymore. Everything is secured for the sake of oligarchs.
Is there anything else about the report in particular that you wanted to mention?
There are many unanswered questions. We are trying to look further into what else we could do more. But I think it's important to mention that there is one big company that Prabowo owns, abandoned for quite many years. But as soon as he won the election, at least from my observation in the area where the company operates, my team and I went to Berau, East Kalimantan, to investigate the asset. And we got stories, evidence, and information that auditors were auditing the company, and they are planning to revive the operations early next year. And some insiders told us that they got investments already. So it shows how Prabowo gaining power will bring a fresh breath into his abandoned businesses. I cannot say with other assets because we did not find as significant and progressive information as Kiani Kertas.
I also wanted to ask you about the previous Indonesian president. The sort of joint candidate or deputy candidate of Prabowo is the son of the previous president. Does the previous president also have a lot of commercial interests, which he still had as when he was president?
Before he joined politics, former President Jokowi was a businessman. He has long-time business in furniture. There is one report by an Indonesian independent newsroom, detailing all of the businesses that his sons owns and his sons' friends own, which have been growing a lot since he was president. Former President Jokowi's power also contributed to this growing business that his family owns.
One of the other reports on the Gecko Project website talks about the risks to environmental activists and disappearances in Indonesia. I know that's not your investigation, but how safe were you in conducting your investigation? And is that an issue at all?
Not safe at all. And I'm a member of Indonesian Independent Journalists Alliance. We have been discussing this, and we are seeing an increase of threats to journalists in Indonesia, especially those outside of Jakarta. It seems that we are going to see more physical threats, actually, but for non-state actors who are affiliated to the state. We call them preman, like gangster-like group. This is what we journalists in Indonesia are really concerned about, that any random people might come to you anywhere and make it as if it's an accident or something, but actually if you go through it, it's something because of your work. I had this fear after we released the report on the president, actually. I talked to a group of friends who have access to journalist security, and we set up a system where I had to stay in my room for a certain period and report it regularly and be very cautious every time I went outside. It's the foreseeable trend. So like digital threats and all of those legal threats, we will still see them. But these physical threats by the gangster group will also need to be anticipated.
And have you had any kinds of threats so far?
No. But physical threats is not an alien issue to me.
You were saying that journalists outside of Jakarta are most at threat. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, because they are far away from facilities, yeah. I think it's best to help me explain by citing an example. Yeah, we previously worked with a freelancer from Sulawesi on a project. This freelancer helped us access local sources, including paramilitary groups. We were so concerned about his safety during the reporting and especially after publication because all of these sources we talked to, we got to know them through him. So they talked to him on our behalf. So if they were unhappy, for example, they would go to him first. And if anything happened to him, Alasdair, where should he go? If we had to, for example, fly him to Jakarta, it would take time. So that's what I meant with threats is more imminent for our friends outside of Jakarta. When I went to Papua for my reporting project, it always reminded me of my privilege as a journalist from Jakarta because if anything happened, you could go out easily. But if anything happened with Papua regarding their political turmoils, etc., where would they go? Because it's their land, it's their homes. I've been disturbed with impacts of investigative reports produced by Indonesian newsrooms. Not only Gecko, but all of us, because we need to work more and with more partners outside of Indonesia to get support in order to volume up the message here.
Thanks very much to Margareth Aritonang for her time. As always, there's further reading on our podcast blurb, including links to Margareth's investigation and other Gecko Project work. Thank you to Vasco Kostowski for audio and engineering the show, and Bertie will be back in 2 weeks' time with another interview. Thanks for listening.